Hi everyone, welcome to Reason with Science. I'm your host Jitendra. This is second part of the conversation with Randy Schekman. He is one of the recipients of the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2013. He is an investigator of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. In this conversation, we talk about his work on scientific publishing, his suggestions for early career researchers, and his experience on Parkinson's project. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thank you for listening. Okay, hi Randy. Welcome for part two for our discussion.
Good to be back.
Yeah, so in part one, we discussed about your work on vesicular trafficking, on a bit about exosomes, and also your work on scientific publishing and genesis of e-life. So, I mean, of course, your views are really interesting, especially for the early career researchers. But then there are some more questions which it'll be really interesting to know your views on those sort of questions. First, I think a very important question is what to work on, like how to choose a question, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay, happy to answer that. My view is that at the outset of a career, when you're beginning to, if you have an opportunity to explore something independently, that you should be willing to take gambles. I think really the most successful scientists are people who take risks, who don't just do the next obvious thing, who don't just continue to do what they did as a postdoc, even if it was a successful program. They strike off in a new direction, maybe joining the knowledge that they gained from their PhD work as well as from their postdoctoral work, and developing a new problem, a new. Let me just turn off my noisy mail. A new technique, a new a problem that hasn't been explored in a new and potentially useful organism. And I give this advice always to beginning people, but people are very cautious. People, even excellent scientists, are very conservative, and they feel that they won't get funding, or they won't get students, or they won't get recognition if they're doing something completely new. And that, of course, that's a risk. But you know, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So for me, the most interesting young colleagues that I have do something brand new. And then, of course, they demonstrate their skills by succeeding at that new thing. But it's risky, I admit, and it's not for everybody. But anyway, one must consider that, at least at the outset of a career. One must really think creatively, with deep knowledge of the general field of interest, to find some new angle. And so, you know, some of the great discoveries came by serendipity. I'm thinking, for instance, of one of the great nucleic acid chemists of his generation, Thomas Cech, who discovered catalytic RNA. Now, he was continuing a problem that he had started as a postdoctoral fellow at MIT, but he made an amazing chance observation that an in vitro transcribed ribosomal RNA from this ciliate called tetrahymena seemed to be able to splice itself. And then he took note of this and went to great lengths to demonstrate that it was actually the RNA doing it, not anything else. And he had enough confidence and enough skill to be able to do something that others would have just dismissed as an artifact. And he changed biology as a result of that discovery. I mean, there are few discoveries that are so profoundly dramatic as that one. And so he took a risk and he won. So now, not everybody has that skill, but at least one should strive for that, I think.
Yeah, because I think this also relates with what we were talking about scientific publishing, because I mean, you have to have that bold ideas, also in your work. So to publish wherever you want, and that it will be accepted later, like the work will continue.
Yeah, yeah. As I don't recall exactly what I said, but what I've said on many other occasions is the problem with the what I call luxury journals is they're looking for something that's going to be a sensation right away. And so those are necessarily things that that are already current and are popular and advance perhaps even only incrementally a popular subject. And that's because these journals, whether they say so or not, rely on citations, potential citations for their papers, as measured crudely by this journal impact factor. And what's really pernicious about this journal impact factor, I mean, one of the many things that's bad about it is the citations are based over just a 2-year window for a journal. So they count the number of citations to papers published in that journal just over a 2-year window. And so that means that it's only articles that are going to be an instant sensation that count. Mendel himself would have been an utter failure in the modern era, with his work not recognized for decades. That's maybe an extreme case.
Yeah. The other important thing is in general, the importance of collaboration. So be it like working as a PhD or postdoc, or starting as starting a new career, right? Yeah. So what is the importance of collaboration in science? And also if you can comment on the collaborative peer review, which you introduced in eLife. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say that in my own career, for the earliest couple of decades of my career, I worked independently. I didn't have many collaborators. But I was using techniques that were already well developed. I wasn't developing really new technology. I could use techniques that were already well established. But now, many of the toughest problems require a range of very sophisticated techniques that one individual is unlikely to master. Techniques of real-time visualization of cells, or techniques of genome editing that require specialized knowledge. So I think that in the modern era, the really toughest problems require an individual to seek collaborative engagement by other scientists. And then you have to learn the give and take of a collaboration. So, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but my feeling is that the reward structure for academic science, unfortunately, favors the individual. It's his or her paper, where his or her name is on the list of authors, where it's published. And people, particularly young people who collaborate for the majority of their work, can actually be in some difficulty when it comes time for peer review of their productivity. A faculty governance committee may look at a young colleague who's published most of his or her papers with other colleagues and wonder, well, what if this is his? That's the wrong question, I think. But unfortunately, it's not uncommon. So, in the real world, outside of academic life, it's all about the team. In biotech, in any industry, it's about the team. It's the team that succeeds, the team that makes progress. It's not, the individuals can be recognized for their contribution, but it really is what that contribution is to the success of the team. And that ethic has yet to develop in academic science. It's something that we strive for in this new Parkinson's initiative that we've established, where it's teams of investigators that have come together and that must work together and must work with other teams. And it's something in a smaller way that we developed for this journal eLife, where the reviewers who agree to review a paper do so independently, but then when they're done, their reviews are shared with each other, and their identities are revealed to each other, and they then must contribute to some conversation, an online conversation about what may be necessary to make the paper publishable or not. And so that's a kind of collaboration where of peers. And I think it eliminates the problem that many of the so-called high-profile journals have with anonymous reviewers who are anonymous to each other and who can then get away with saying anything and not have to defend it because their reputation will not be at stake. Whereas in the eLife model, since you have to be identified to the other reviewers, if you say something stupid or you're arrogant or something, you know, it leaves a bad impression. So you have to behave yourself. I think it civilizes the process a bit, which is why we felt strongly that the reviewers had to be willing to be identified, at least to each other. If not to the author, they had to be unblinded to each other. And that's worked. Very few people have declined to review because they didn't want to be open with comments. So that was that kind of collaboration on a smaller scale was what convinced me when I started this new Parkinson's initiative to look for investigators who have had experience in collaboration. As I said, it's not, you know, there are people, everyone collaborates, but usually it's a short-term collaboration. But there are some examples of enduring collaborations that go on for many years over many individual projects. And the individuals who succeed in such a relationship have learned to share and not just to take all the credit to themselves. And that's what we were looking for. We were looking for people who had who demonstrated that skill. And we're hoping that that will make a difference when all the teams have to communicate with each other.
That's, I mean, I checked that model and that was certainly impressive. I think that the fact that the early career researchers were given certain preference was also, I think, on spot, like to really highlight the importance of the collaboration, but also, you know, to help somehow early career researchers.
Sure. The early career scientists who participate in each team may not have had the experience of that kind of collaboration, but they will, under the guidance of the more senior people in the team, hopefully appreciate the value of that.
Yeah, but do you think that, so now, of course, I mean, it's been close to a decade that you've been open about open science in general, the impact factor and everything. So do you see any change in the evaluation process as well? Like that the committees are looking beyond now these high profile journals and etc., or it's more or less the same?
Not enough. I mean, there are small inroads. I think the biggest progress has been in really forcing these high profile journals to be open access. So for instance, now the major commercial journals have had to accept that people can post their work on something like the bioRxiv when it's ready to be considered for publication. That really is a change in their culture. These commercial journals used to not only insist that you not post unpublished results, but they sometimes would punish an investigator if they spoke about work in a meeting and then submitted it for publication. I mean, if you can believe that, because they wanted all the credit to be for the benefit of the journal, not for the investigator. So that's a good thing. And because of this largely European Coalition S, Plan S effort, many publishers have now reluctantly agreed to make their contents open access over a period of time. They're slowly moving in that direction. So that's good. I think that's good. But what hasn't changed really is still the culture of scholars feeling that they simply have to have their work in certain vanity journals. just a sec, I gotta. And the committees that are evaluating people for fellowships and positions often look to whether young people have published in these journals, and very, very discouraging. And I by myself don't have enough influence to change that. So I think a lot of colleagues recognize that it's inappropriate to look just at the name of the journal in considering the importance of, but it's hard for them to ignore that. I mean, really, what people need to do in evaluating a scholar is to read the work, not. And many of the review committees for funding agencies have devised ways of encouraging that. So, for instance, in the U.S., for investigators of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, they have a very high standard, extremely high standard. And when you're either evaluated for getting a position or for renewal of that position, the evaluating committee is given a list of the most important papers that an individual has published, wherever it's published. And they're really asked to look at those papers, just those few papers, to make their determination, and not just to look at where they're published. And I believe that happens, but that's the exception. That's the exception rather than the rule. So it's the power of these commercial journals is enormous. They branded themselves so effectively that people just instinctively think that if they don't have a paper in Nature, they're just a failure. And that's just not true. It's just not true. There are good examples of established and junior people who succeed in publishing in journals that are run by and for scientists. My position for my group is there are plenty of journals that I'm willing to publish in, but the principle has to be that every decision that's made at the journal has to be made by an active scientist, not by a professional editor. And the problem, and I hate to say this, but the problem with these professional editors is they're not up to the task. They have trained as scientists. Most of them have been postdocs. But then when they work for a big publisher, they're called on to handle papers in broad areas outside of their expertise. And so they can't really themselves independently make independent judgments. They have to, of course, to rely on scholars that are willing to review the paper. But the job of an editor is not simply to pick the experts to do the reviews. It's also to judge the comments of the reviewers and to decide which things are really important and which things are not. And we handle that at eLife by having the reviewers serve collaboratively. But in other journals that don't do that, particularly at journals like Cell and Nature and Science, the real power is with the individual editor, who has to somehow judge. And very often they can't judge, so they just send it out again and again and again, or they send it to more and more people, hoping that someone will give them some wisdom. But what happens too often is that they just say, well, it's one referee has negative comments, and they say, well, you're just going to have to fix it. And a scholar who knows the field wouldn't necessarily come to that conclusion. So it's a real problem. And yet people are willing to struggle for years sometimes to get their paper published in these vanity journals. And it's just, it's very discouraging to see that waste of time.
I think one issue is that probably we should also discuss that in general, to understand the quality of the research itself, quality of science, because as we started, right, so there is one thing, how to select a question, and now question can be anything, but there has to be a certain value of that question, which may add something to the science, right? And then it comes to, of course, the selection committees, can be also the peer review system, everything. But
Mhm.
at the end, probably, I think it's key to address that, like how we can understand the quality of science
Yeah,
in the,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Well, in the end, it's up to peers. It's up to people who are in the field, who know, what's going on in the field, and who can judge the importance of an individual's contribution. So I've argued, rather than having a list of papers and journals, or in addition to having that list, that every scholar should curate a statement, an impact statement, let's call it, a paragraph, or no more than a page, that accurately describes the substance of the individual's discoveries in context. And now people would say, well, how do you know if someone's misrepresenting their work and making it seem more important? So I thought, well, one way to handle that would be to have the paragraph or the page co-signed by two scholars in the area who are not connected to the individual, but who know the area. Just sign your name. I agree this is an accurate statement, something like that. I would prefer, if a search committee is faced with hundreds of applications for a job or a fellowship, I would prefer to have that one simple statement as a first pass to make a short list of candidates, and then to explore the selected candidates more deeply. But unfortunately, what happens is, as we've said, the search committee looks and sees you've got 3 Nature papers, and I think about this: the Nature editor, or the Cell or the Science editor, is unknown. This person is anonymous. So yeah, so this is a point. It's uncomfortable to say this because I know some of these people, and I know they're honest and hardworking, but they're anonymous. And for instance, if I would ask you, if you look at one of these journals, Cell, Nature, or Science, if I asked you who was the editor for this paper, you won't know, even though it is one person who handled the paper for the journal. And that's because the journal doesn't want them to be known. Whereas a journal that's run by scholars, the person who edited the paper is somewhere written on the paper, so you know who's responsible for this decision. Yeah, I think this is intellectually dishonest. I should think that as an employee of one of these publishers, that you would want to have the pride of ownership of saying, I handled this paper. I think these people are being cheated. And, a really good one who made good decisions, who happened to be the editor on lots of papers, would be recognized and promoted, and, but no. And I've made this point to the editors-in-chief of these journals. Why don't you do this? And they come up with some excuse. Oh, we never thought about that baloney. And these editors, whether they'll of course say will disagree with this, they're promoted on the basis of the papers that generate lots of citations, because they're in the business of selling magazines. Whereas an editor at eLife, I guarantee you, they're not selling anything. The journal loses money. So, but I can say these things until I'm blue in the face, and a young scholar will shrug his or her shoulders and say, this is a system that your generation created. I just have to survive. I get this all the time. It's very frustrating.
Well, maybe I think let's talk about this, the other interesting project that you are part of, the Parkinson's project, because I think that's also an example. Like you started with the funding, and then like you guys really set it up with the action plan, with the who's gonna get the grants, etc. I think that already sets the example, how we can change things. because
Yeah.
that starts from the funding, how you select
Yeah.
people, and then it
Oh, yeah.
till the point you publish things, right?
Sure.
Like you
Oh, absolutely.
include these things. So
Yeah,
that's
when you have a source of money and you're giving it out, you get people's attention. So we have in our the funding for this program, ASAP, we've insisted that everyone has to post their work on the bioarchive when it's ready to be submitted for publication. And we've insisted that they publish in open access journals. However, of course, the definition of open access journals is changing as a result of what I said earlier through the influence of Plan S. Many of the commercial publishers have finally agreed in principle to become what they call transformative journals. That is, they're moving in the direction of open access. Of course, I'm very skeptical about this, but our funded groups have to publish in one of the journals that is either open access or is moving in that direction. So that's all we can do. We can't tell them they can't publish in Cell, Nature, or Science. I mean, that wouldn't work. So we're trying, and I think other funding, the Wellcome Trust in Britain and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in the US also have policies that really force people to publish in open access journals. So that's good. And so now the big federal agencies, the governmental agencies, need to have similar policies. I'm actually quite optimistic that in the next 10 years, most of the work will be in open access journals. I'm also involved in something that you may know, I bet you know about. There's a very brave woman in Russia who publishes something called Sci-Hub, or promotes the open access against the wishes of the publishers. And she's kind of an outlaw, but she's very brave, and I applaud what she's doing. And it's really forcing. I mean, the publishers have been going after her, trying to get her arrested through Interpol and suing her, but she's out of. This is one example where the being protected by Russia is a good thing, I think. But she's a symptom of the problem. This is not a solution. She's a symptom of the problem with the power that these commercial journals have. So I still think the system is broken, but I'm not able to change it myself.
Yeah, but maybe I think if the scientific practices in general, they get better, because it's also like how we start. And if it gets better with more dialogues and people understand the problem, I think it'll get.
I think the people I speak with, to the extent that they care. I mean, a lot of people don't care open access. A lot of people just don't care. But the ones who care and who understand, they don't change because they say they have to play the game. Here's an example, a comparison that I find really most troubling. This is frankly political. In the US, to the extent that you followed our politics, the Republican Party now is owned by Donald Trump. And although privately, Republicans in office find it appalling, in public, they salute him, they stand by him, they agree with everything he does, because they feel that they won't get reelected if they don't support him. This is the same attitude that scientists have when they publish in these vanity journals. It's the same attitude. Maybe it's not as dangerous, but it's the same attitude. It's the same social pressure to conform.
Yeah, but I think it's again like I don't know at which point we can start. I mean, since I had a talk with other like philosophers of science, etc., because this understanding of scientific method in general.
Yeah.
Like if people, they really understand what science is, how it works, it will change the attitude for these kind of issues as well, right?
Well, this doesn't necessarily affect the scientific, this doesn't relate to the scientific method. That's above it all. It's a question of how you promote your own work. It affects, unfortunately, it also affects what people choose to work on. And it maybe diminishes the creativity of some people because they're afraid of not getting their papers published in these vanity journals if they're too extremely out there. Anyway, it's fun to talk about. Of course, in my position, I don't have to worry about it, and my students never question me about this because they know what answer they'll get. And you could say, well, I'm being hypocritical, and people accuse me of this all the time because I used to publish in those journals, and but they didn't behave as badly, I think, back then. This nonsense of journal impact factor was never a consideration when I was first publishing, when I was first independent. I never, that number existed, but no one ever used it as a criterion. So,
yeah. So do you think it's because of the shift in sort of pressure of publishing, that you need to publish and you need to publish a lot, and that's why it's...
Well, the business of publishing a lot, that's been true for a long time. That's a separate problem. It's the business of where you publish that has become more pathological, I think. When I was a graduate student and early in my career, the journal that I wanted to have my work in was called the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and that was all work that was judged by prominent scholars. It wasn't it wasn't in the decision of a publisher. And the journal itself was never intended to make a profit. It was run by the National Academy of Sciences, and I know, because I was editor, that the charter for the PNAS is they can't make money, and nor can they cost money. They have to break even. So they're not in the business of selling magazines. The commercial publishers are.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about your work on Parkinson. What, like in this project, what you guys are trying to bring together?
Mm-hmm. Well, the objective from the start, from the Sergey Brin Family Foundation, was to have a program focused entirely on basic science. And I'm not a Parkinson's researcher. I mean, we do something sort of related, but I became involved in this through my personal situation. My wife had Parkinson's and died of it. And that's when they asked me to take this on. And it was Mr. Brin himself, who has a family history of the disease, who said that he felt that really the problem was that we just didn't understand the origin and mechanism of the disease. And so all this clinical work hasn't really led to a deeper understanding that could then lead to more effective treatments. So our objective is purely to understand at a molecular and cellular level where it begins, what happens, how it progresses, and to identify targets that could then be used to develop therapies. And so the plan was to create an international network of teams of investigators. Each team has 4 to 5 PIs, led by a person who has had experience in collaboration, either in Parkinson's or something else. And the teams have to have people from outside just one, they can't just be at one institution. It has to be at least two institutions.
We're done.
Okay, can you wait a few more minutes?
Yes, a few minutes, okay.
Yeah. But and then it has to include an early career investigator. And we're looking for, gender balance if possible, certainly geographic balance. And a willingness, the people who do this have to be willing to communicate preliminary results, protocols, share reagents with anybody within the network. And so there is an understanding within the network that there's confidentiality. They can't be talking about other people's work outside of the network, and they have to join in. So this started really, it wasn't intended to be this way, but with the pandemic, it was all online. It was going to be all online anyway. So we have a very active network engagement where people give talks and group meetings and subgroup meetings. And there are seminars all the time online. And we have our first scheduled meeting next April. We'll see if that can happen. I hope it can happen. And we've committed almost $500 million now to 65 teams of over 150 PIs. So we'll see. I mean, it's a big expensive experiment, but the goal is to make discoveries that could then serve as the foundation for therapies. We've not funded clinical work or drug development. We're looking at all preclinical work. People who make discoveries with funding from ASAP may choose to seek intellectual property on those discoveries, and they can do so. We won't make any claim on that. So we expect people will develop patents that we won't be evaluating them on that basis, but they're free to do that. In fact, it's encouraged. And at least initially, we were hopeful that people in biotech companies would be part of teams, but they probably feel that they can't afford to do basic science without some prior protection, and we don't offer that. We have some people who have company connections, but not so much. It's mostly in universities and research institutes. So it's been just a little over 1 year for the first teams. We just appointed a number of new teams in a related but slightly different area. And what we'll do is when the first teams are up for full review after 3 years, we'll make a decision about whether to extend the funding for another 2 years. And then at 5 years, we'll make a decision about new rounds for possibly new teams or possibly renewal of some of the teams, depending on how well they play in this network. And we have ways of evaluating whether they're really contributing to the network as opposed to just publishing, star papers. We're really looking for this collaboration as a major criterion for success.
Yeah, first of all, I'm sorry for your loss. The other thing is that, of course, for 200 years, it was known, and it's been about 200 years that Parkinson was already reported, right? Mm-hmm. And how less we know yet, this was really striking to see. Mm-hmm. And of course, once I was preparing this, I also looked at other neurodegenerative diseases, and I saw that most of them, they have this, basically the IDPs, the unstructured proteins, which they make fibrils, and and they cause these kind of problems, right?
Well, but I should caution you, we don't know that they cause the problem. We know that they're proteins that have unstructured domains that appear in the pathology. And we know some of them really at the root are the cause. In Alzheimer's disease, it's quite clear that amyloid precursor protein and gamma secretase, because of the genetics, they have to be involved. the assumption, the incorrect assumption, I believe, has been made that it's the amyloid plaque that accumulates in the brain of an Alzheimer's patient that is the cause of the disease. And that I think that's just wrong. And it's been a tragic mistake that's cost billions of dollars and, threatens the healthcare system in the United States because of recent approval of a product by the drug company Biogen of an immune therapy that is simply not effective. And if our Medicare system adopts this treatment, it could break the bank. It's an unmitigated disaster. So the problem is that this amyloid hypothesis has been so dominant that it's, shut out other areas of investigation. And I'm very wary of going down that blind alley in our effort. The similar pathology is this accumulation of these structures called Lewy bodies. And the trouble with Lewy, it's certainly a clue, but the problem is it's much worse than with Alzheimer's. At least in Alzheimer's, you can monitor these amyloid plaques in the brain of a patient, using PET scans. There are no such means of evaluating the Lewy bodies in a living Parkinson patient. So it's only a correlation that appears in a biopsy of a deceased person. So to assume that the Lewy body is the basis of the pathology is, making a very risky assumption.
Yeah, I think most of the literature, it just probably points out on the Lewy body hypothesis.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see if something else comes out. Which sure there should be. The other thing is just the accumulation of protein, what it can do. It has to have some extra function there.
No. Mm-hmm.
But the point that I was about to make is the fact, for example, this year, the news of AlphaFold came. We have become better predicting folds.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the next problem is the understanding unfolding proteins and how they are like sort of regulating the functions and doing these diverse things.
We have a number of teams in our network exploring this at a basic level. And I'm obviously very interested in that.
And the other, as you already mentioned, that there are no markers to identify Parkinson, right?
There are some promising leads, but nothing that is easily evaluated in a clinical setting. What we want is a simple assay that could be done in a regular hospital laboratory and not in some, not in a Harvard Medical School. It has to be something that can be looked at in any community. I think we'll get there. In the next few years. There are some promising leads. But other major diseases, heart disease, cancer, there are biomarkers that you can follow, but Parkinson's not. And with Alzheimer's, it's more promising. Not so much amyloid, but tau protein, a particular phosphorylated form of tau, seems to be very highly correlated with and predictive of onset of Alzheimer's. So that's good.
Yeah, and the also causes of these diseases are not clear, right? For example, whether they are genetic or environmental, or it's simply the aging that this is what they generally say, but it's not clear what really causing it, right?
Well, in Parkinson's, it's estimated that maybe 30% of the cases have some genetic predisposition. It may be higher, but so far 30% seems about right. And what the sporadic forms are, it's not known. It could be multiple genetic factors, or it could be environmental toxins. It's just not known yet.
I think the other interesting branch that you added in your program is this neuro immune interactions, because that certainly includes the underappreciated glial cells. I mean,
Yes.
whenever we talk about these diseases, I mean, they are generally focused on neurons and what they are doing. But yes, that'll be really interesting to see, because they can help us understand the propagation of the disease, right?
Yeah.
So I was thinking about it, like what do you think? What can be the solution of this kind of problem? And I mean, are we thinking of a drug, a chemical molecule?
Oh, sure. Well, there are two general approaches. One would be, you know, a pharmaceutical solution. That would be really the best, I would say. But it's not out of the question to have cell transplants, brain cell transplants. There are some promising avenues there, or some genetic approach, some gene editing possibility. Those are the broad areas, and it remains to be seen which one will be effective. But one has to have a sort of an overarching hypothesis to link all of the different factors. There were 20 different genes. It's not obvious how you link all these genes together. I mean, the problem may be that Parkinson's is not one disease. You know, it may be multiple diseases that converge on one limiting thing in the dopaminergic neuron network. But so it may have to be like cancer, where there's not going to be one treatment. It's going to be multiple treatments. But I'll be happy to have one treatment. You know, there's nothing. There's literally nothing. I mean, there are palliative treatments that work for a little while, that mitigate some of the symptoms. But the arc of the disease isn't changed. And that's the tragedy for families that watch it, sometimes decades as their loved one declines. Dementia is a problem with about 30%. That's what my wife suffered from. And, that's really very difficult to manage.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you for accepting the invitation again and discussing the different topics that you're working on.
Happy to do so.
Thank
okay,
you so much.
Jitendra, have a good week. Have a good holiday.
You too.
Hope to meet you sometime.
Yes, sure. Bye.
Okay, bye.
Yeah, bye.